once we lay the foundation of unified, capital efficient, permissionless slash automatic liquidity for a world of millions of chains, then we can start building more building blocks on top of that.
What's up, Modular fam? I'm here again with another episode of Celestia Spotlight. I have Jim from Catalyst here. Catalyst is building cross-chain liquidity for the modular future. And as you guys know, in the modular future, the vision is that we're going to have millions of chains. The thing is, when you have millions of chains, they're going to need some way to bridge assets across from each other so that they can interoperate and users can use all these different apps. And so bridging is a really, really big part of the modular future. So that's why I'm really excited to have Jim to tell us all about Catalyst and how it's solving that problem. And so, Jim, thanks for coming on. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for having me on. Happy to share more about kind of what we're building at Catalyst and kind of give a high level overview of what we're thinking for the future. But yeah, so it's like what you said. Catalyst is basically built for this kind of vision that I think a lot of people have come to consensus around, which is, the modular blockchain thesis and how that kind of, what are kind of the implications of having like, a modularized kind of set of tools and primitives that developers and now, individuals can use. And I think one of the implications is very much like a proliferation of chains and essentially the breaking of kind of a lot of the existing infrastructure we use in that new world, right? And so right now we have smart contracts or we have kind of like DeFi or NFT protocols that kind of work in a multi-chain context of like 5 chains, right, or 6 chains or what have you. But what happens when there's like thousands of chains or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, right? Like you can't just keep deploying the same thing and using the same kind of governance contracts or coordination contracts that we're using. We kind of need to scale that, right? And so those are all the questions and the general through line that Catalyst thinks about. And I would say like broadly, that's our mandate. And right now we're trying to solve what we think is the most pressing issue within that kind of problem statement, which is bridging, like what you're mentioning, right? Like very kind of foundational and baseline is just like, okay, how do you actually move value between these chains in the world of proliferation of chains? And so that's kind of our mandate.
Got it. So it's bridging is the first step, but the long-term vision for Catalyst is to solve all the various problems of coordinating applications across this really vast multi-chain future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could talk more about that later in the chat. But yeah, I think like right now, 100% of our focus is on this kind of bridging piece. Like we see ourselves as like our team we're mainly like cross chain experts, right? Like we love cross chain, we love interoperability, and we think about it all the time. But we're kind of also applying our DeFi background to kind of solving this really foundational problem right now.
Cool. Well, yeah, why don't we dive into the slides? I think you prepared a presentation, and then we can go from there.
Like what we said, Catalyst is cross-chain liquidity for the modular future. And so basically what we're going to walk through quickly is kind of what is the modular future, kind of what is the problem statement that kind of lines up with that, and why we think Catalyst is the perfect solution to solve the liquidity piece of that. And so, yeah, the problem, I can kind of breeze through this because we already kind of talked about it in a more truncated sense earlier. But the future will have millions of chains. We think by modularizing what was previously a monolithic kind of set of functions that a blockchain did into the 4 different disparate pieces allows for a lot of scalability, ease of deployment, and customization at various levels, especially the execution level. And so when we look at it from an execution sense, we think that every application will essentially have its own chain or have its own rollup, right? It'll have its own execution environment that's tailor-made to perfectly do the exact things that this application wants it to do, right? It's going to have the right gas prices. It's going to have a native gas token. It's going to have optimizations on the opcode level. It's going to have MEV capture, et cetera, right? And so don't need to kind of go down that rabbit hole necessarily, but this is something that we think is kind of like a consensus take at this point, that like we want to customize and optimize these execution layers using the modular blockchain stack. And because of that, since every application will have its own chain, and we think there's going to be, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of chains, therefore you can kind of come to a logical conclusion that there's just going to be a lot of chains. And so that's awesome, right? I think we're all very excited for kind of this future of a proliferation of chains. But unfortunately, there are implications that come from that that we need to be thinking about. And so in this kind of modular future world, what does that kind of look like? And so the first thing that happens once we have a world of millions of chains is that we lose kind of the connectivity that we used to have when we all had kind of applications on a shared state machine. And so that's not really kind of a good thing, right? It was kind of the drawing point of crypto, kind of the ethos of crypto, to have the sense of connectivity and to kind of be able to share the states of one another. That was kind of the drawing point of Ethereum, at least when it started with its world computer narrative. And so losing that by having kind of a proliferation of chains is not ideal. Related to that is the composability piece, right? With DeFi Summer, with the narrative of money Legos, we did see the power of what it means to permissionlessly combine different primitives together, or have some form of atomicity when you create transactions in the form of flash loans or what have you. And so we also lose that, right? When we move to a multi-chain context, we're no longer able to have those guarantees, which is kind of defeating the purpose of the magic of crypto as we've seen it. And we also lose existing infrastructure. And so this is kind of a really important piece that I don't really see a lot of people talking about. But all the things that we enjoy in kind of monolithic blockchain environments do break in kind of this context. And so, the wallets that we enjoy, the data indexing / block explorer / analytics dashboards that we enjoy aren't able to kind of keep up with the pace of continuous deployments of chains, right? Same said with kind of RPC nodes and governance kind of frameworks and oracles. And so this kind of is a bit of a snowballing effect, so to speak, when we have a lot of these different chains and they break kind of the existing structures and standards in place that allow us to actually access the information, interact with the information from these chains. And so that really bodes the question of, okay, we have a world of millions of chains. Lots of things are going to break. We're going to lose a lot of the magic of what crypto is in this future. So how are we actually building for the modular future? And I kind of lay out 3 really important principles. So the first important principle is automatic, which kind of makes sense, right? As there are more and more chains kind of spinning up, it becomes incredibly trivial to the point of, 1 click, 2 clicks of deploying an execution environment. You want to actually automatically integrate them as they go live, right? And so right now, that isn't necessarily the case, right? When a new chain goes live, there's a whole kind of process in which, these new chains need to be integrated into a lot of existing infrastructure. And in the future, we need to change that. We need to have automatic inclusion of these new chains. And so things that I think are really exciting are modular cloud, of course, right? Formerly known as Celestia Scan is kind of thinking out this from a data indexing perspective. And then MetaMask is not quite automatic, but I think as good of a automatic experience that we have right now, in the sense that, okay, if you're following some sort of general specification, you have a chain ID, you can kind of just add it to MetaMask. But we do need something that is a bit more scalable in the future as it pertains to the wallet design space. We also need it to be permissionless, right? It kind of doesn't make sense if we have this world of millions of chains and you kind of need to go through a belabored kind of governance process or have some sort of, offline or off-chain BD meeting in order to actually deploy, products or actually connect these chains together. We need that to be, as easy as possible so that, it could be kind of an open cross-chain economy, so to speak, that can transact with one another. And so things that I think are really cool from a permissionless perspective are, JokeDAO and Caldera as well, which is a roll up as a service project. And then we need to be extensible, right? I think, the notion that we live in we can enforce kind of a single standard in which execution environments or just modular blockchains in general can operate in, it is a bit naive. I think kind of the genie's out of the bottle there. And so how are you actually building primitives that are flexible enough to adapt or to easily expand to this heterogeneous environment? It is super important. And so, right now we have kind of a world of different VMs, different consensus mechanisms, signature schemes, etc. We kind of need to move to a world in which we have some sense of not quite shared standards, but a way in which, or an adaptable way in which these protocols can go into these different VMs and consensus mechanisms quite trivially. And so our solution, when we think about this design space, is how do we take these three principles of what building for the modular future looks like and actually applying that to what we think is one of the most important problems in the space, which is just connecting chains together and moving value to and from them. And so the first thing that we're doing is automatic chain connections. And so the power of Catalyst that I think makes it very different from any other kind of liquidity layer or any kind of bridge out there right now is that as new chains come live, Catalyst is built in a way in which, the connections to these chains actually come out of the box, right? If you have Catalyst and you're a new chain that's being deployed, you can automatically start swapping with any other chain that has Catalyst. And I can talk a little bit more about how that's possible. The second thing that we have is permissionlessness. And so we have permissionless cross-chain pools. And so kind of similar to how chains are automatically kind of connected through Catalyst, we also have the ability to permissionlessly create new pools on any of these chains. And so let's say, you're a new Polygon modular chain, and of course you want to support Matic, but you want to facilitate swaps from Ethereum as well. Again, once this Polygon modular chain is deployed, it can actually connect to any other chain that Catalyst is deployed on. But you still need a pool to be created, right? You need some sort of value to be deposited so that these tokens can start swapping. And so in this case, you can just connect to the Catalyst smart contract on Ethereum, connect to the ETH pool, have your Matic pool on the Polygon modular chain, and you can start permissionlessly swapping. Again, this is all straight from out of the gate upon initialization of this Polygon modular chain. And then lastly, we have an extensible protocol design. Catalyst essentially is built in a way that is so lightweight and extensible that it kind of spans, it can be deployed into different kind of virtual machines or different kind of other specifications of an execution environment quite trivially. And again, I can talk more about how that's the case. And that's really powerful because, again, we're kind of seeing this environment of different virtual machines, different standards, different ways in which data is communicated and propagated. And Catalyst is, again, flexible enough to kind of navigate all those things, actually quite trivially. And so that's something that we're incredibly proud of because, again, we're building for this modular future of a lot of different standards and environments. And we want to make sure that we can capture them all in a very lightweight and extensible way. And so I talked a lot about how we built Catalyst based on those three principles and why we think that's really well fit for the modular future. But I think I should actually say what Catalyst does. And so Catalyst is essentially an AMM. That's the mechanism design that Catalyst deploys in order to facilitate these kind of cross-chain swaps. And they do so by essentially having assets that live in pools, but on separate chains. And so in this instance, we have, again, that similar example I use. We have ETH on Ethereum, and we also have Matic on this Polygon modular chain. What Catalyst does is essentially allows for the swapping of these tokens by using something that we call the unit of liquidity. And essentially what the unit of liquidity is it's a calculation of how much kind of liquidity that's been added into the origin pool. And you kind of calculate that into kind of a shared number or a shared standard that every Catalyst smart contract understands as a universal form of liquidity. And then upon receipt of that message on the destination chain, they can then withdraw the necessary amount of Matic into the user's wallet. And so let's walk through this specific use case. Let's say a user deposits 1 ETH onto Ethereum. You can see here that now the ETH, which is C in this case, has increased into the pool. What Catalyst does is it just calculates how many units of liquidity have been deposited, and they send that as a cross-chain message. And so in this case, let's say 3 units of liquidity have been deposited, and they send it as a message. And so once the Catalyst smart contract pool receives that information on the Polygon modular chain, they then convert that into how much Matic needs to be deposited or withdrawn from the chain, withdrawn from the pool into the user's wallet. And so again, that's actually how Catalyst works. It's pretty simple. User deposits assets. Catalyst is basically calculating this mathematical value. It gets passed as a message. Upon receipt on the destination chain, again, the pool sends the Matic into the user's wallet. And so from the user's perspective, they just sold 1 ETH and they got the liquidity equivalent amount of Matic in their wallet on a different chain. And so that's kind of interesting in a one-to-one use case, right? Kind of interesting. I think what becomes more interesting is thinking about it from a one-to-many use case. And so Catalyst can kind of connect to, not just a one-to-one relationship, but a one-to-many relationship, right? And so in this instance, let's say the user wants to swap their ETH, but doesn't actually want Matic from Polygon modular chain. They actually have the option to, redeem essentially their liquidity units from any other chain on the Catalyst network, so to speak. And so in this instance, they say, okay, I actually want DYDX on the DYDX app chain, which is in Cosmos in this case, and they can absolutely do that and receive DYDX on their DYDX app chain wallet. Sorry, I said DYDX a lot of times. So that is at least at a high level or somewhat of a 202 level how Catalyst works. But hopefully that kind of explains why we're building what we're building, the values behind what we're building, and a little bit of a sneak peek into kind of how it works from a mechanism design perspective.
Thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. There's a lot to dig into. I have probably just some really super basic questions first for the audience to kind of like help understand a little bit better. So, so that you mentioned there's these pools on these different chains. Are they all kind of unified into one pool, or are there separate pools between each chain?
So the way that Catalyst works is there are assets that live in chains, right? So like there would be a pool per asset for each chain, and they're connected to other pools of assets on other chains.
And so like each pool is kind of like is doing accounting about itself, saying like this is how many liquidity units I have in my pool, and like as a user, I have a certain number of those units of liquidity belong to me, and then at any moment I can say, hey, I want to, redeem this unit of liquidity on a different chain to withdraw like an asset somewhere else. So they are kind of like one unified pool, but they're living on different chains essentially. They speak the same language.
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of think, I think there's two helpful ways to frame the unit of liquidity. One is that, you use the word accounting. It's very much just an accounting abstraction, right? It's like there is a unified kind of like metric that all the Catalyst pools use in order to communicate how much liquidity there is. And essentially we're just kind of moving them around such that, in the composite system view, the liquidity remains equal, right? And that's how we ensure like a competitive price and an accurate price between these cross-chain pools of different assets. So that's like one good framing. And another framing used is like, it's basically like a receipt, right?
Hmm.
It's like a receipt that you can kind of redeem in any other Catalyst pool in the destination chain.
Got it. And
Yeah.
I know that you guys are still, in the process of releasing the white paper, so you can't necessarily share everything. So feel free to like just, say that you'll answer certain questions later. But um, when uh, when I like, so how is it possible that the chain knows the amount of liquidity it has? Does it have like an oracle? Like, how does it know the value of those assets to be able to like manage the accounting part?
Yeah, that's not something that I can provide too much detail into
Uh,
at the moment.
okay.
But I will say that it's not an oracle. We don't rely on oracles in
Hmm.
order to price these assets. We're also only using native assets, so there's no form of like wrap token or virtualized liquidity. So you're just using the native assets.
Whoa.
But essentially, like at a high level, Catalyst is a math library that ensures the synchronized accounting of the entire
Mm.
system. And how that's done is will be revealed with our white paper in the coming
Ooh,
weeks.
that is juicy. I am excited to hear how that works. Um, all right. So some one last like really basic question. So what are the components of Catalyst, right? So obviously there's the sort of like pool contract where I can like deposit things, but then is there some other contract that is managing, passing messages between the different chains? Is there is there like a relayer kind of I guess responsibility or role in the protocol, or do you use some kind of existing message passing service that handles that side of it for you?
Yeah, so there's three pieces, the catalyst. Excuse me. So the first piece is kind of what we were just discussing, right?
Hmm.
It's like the pools that hold the assets, and basically communicate like the units of liquidity, or calculate units of liquidity within these pools and then eventually communicate them. The second piece is our like cross-chain messaging interface. And so we don't have our own like relaying network to pass this information. What we do instead is we essentially leverage, or, said differently, like piggyback off of existing kind of arbitrary messaging protocols in order to pass this unit of liquidity message, right? Amongst other metadata that's important, like destination address and some other things. And so like that we're basically leveraging like AMBs,
Mm.
which is why kind of where we see ourselves is very much like a pure liquidity play, as opposed to like competing in like the general message passing space. So that's kind of the second piece. And then the third piece is basically we have like security mechanisms, right? And so in addition to the security that we inherit from our arbitrary messaging protocol kind of partners, we also have our own, or like the protocol has its own kind of opinion on what security should be. And so that's essentially, said in two ways, like rate limits, at least to start, right? As a form of training wheels. And then the second piece is even with the training wheels off, we have an anomaly detector. And so an intelligent way in which we're able to detect, erroneous transactions essentially. And again, can share more about that in the coming weeks. But we want to have many layers of security because we are operating in a very, you know, scrutinized space,
Yeah,
to say the least.
absolutely. And I mean, the theme of last year, I feel, was, major bridge hacks. And so it's really smart to be cautious. And I mean, rate limiting is such a no-brainer. I don't know why that hasn't been implemented, more often. Because obviously, like it's kind of, you'd think it's like there's kind of a common pattern among like bridge hacks where it's like, oh, all of a sudden, all the liquidity is gone, and like maybe it's not a good idea to allow someone to just, in one transaction drain everything. So I'm very happy to hear that. Uh, okay, now the basics are covered. I want to go into some slightly more juicy topics. So the first one I want to talk about is MEV specifically. So last time I had Josh from Astria on, and they're doing shared sequencing, and a big theme there is like cross-chain MEV. And so I feel like a lot of that's arbitrage between different liquidity pools potentially. I mean, there's lots of different forms of it, but it sounds like Catalyst would be something where MEV, cross-chain MEV is going to be a very big part. So how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I will preface and say that cross-chain, or sometimes called cross-domain MEV, is definitely like a emergent research topic. And so we spent a lot of time working with a lot of members of just the broader MEV, broader crypto community, just thinking about what does it mean to, you know, simulate, measure cross-domain MEV, and eventually with the hopes of, mitigating it or harnessing it or what have you, right? Like some sense of like control over the MEV generation slash leakage within a system, right? So that's kind of like the preface that we're kind of all figuring it out together. Um, yeah. With that said, I think any kind of like DeFi protocol, especially if you're thinking about like swaps, needs to think about MEV and kind of the MEV that's being generated in the system. And I think historically, what we've seen is, the way that AMMs are constructed is that there's a lot of kind of MEV being created in the form of like toxic order flow or arbitrage. And that's being kind of leaked out and retained by external parties, right? Whether it be searchers or what have you. Um, and now I think there's a lot of conversation around, okay, like that is kind of value that's being extracted from other parties, and who's kind of taking the short end of the stick there. And that's, LPs, right? Um, and so our perspective, and I think there are, a few other, next gen projects, so to speak, thinking about this is, okay, how do we actually capture the value of this MEV that's being generated and then leaked out to external parties and have it retained within the system, right? And so, Proto Rev with the Skip and Osmosis team is something that comes in mind. And so we're definitely of the camp of kind of that narrative of harnessing MEV that's being generated within the system and kind of redistributing it back into the people that we think are taking on that price discovery risk, right? Which is LPs in this case. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. I think we are, as it evolves, we have the flexibility to also give it to users, right? That are kind of getting, taken advantage of and having MEV taken from them, or we can give it to the protocol broadly. And so we're kind of on the camp of like, I think the word that's being used a lot is like sovereign MEV. It's like, let's kind of just like take control of the MEV that's being generated and distribute it where we see fit, based on kind of the mechanism design that we deploy.
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of a problem that's emerged for AMMs generally that LPs get wrecked, but they're so vital to the system. So, what is their incentive to participate? And I think really the solution is that you have to somehow redirect some of the MEV to subsidize them and incentivize them. So that's really cool, and I'm excited to see where things go there. And also, of course, a big fan of Skip, and I also kind of reminds me of another project, Duality, that's also working on like new forms of AMMs that try to internalize MEV and distribute it in different ways. It's a very interesting research area. So that's cool.
Yeah.
What is your thought on like cross chain UX? Because obviously, I think it's going to be a big part of what you guys build is like making it seamless for users. I want to see a future where I don't are people using app chains or whatever, all these modular blockchains don't even know that they're separate chains really. Um, and it just feels like one kind of unified ecosystem of apps. And I think Catalyst is going to be a big part of that. So how do you think of that?
Yeah. So UX is definitely something that we think a lot about. You know, I think there's enough design space alone in just like the user flow of just bridging an asset or swapping a token that we are really excited to kind of push the boundaries on. But then you kind of add in the cross-chain element, and there's just a lot for us to do in kind of the UX department, right? You know, we're kind of bridging between different environments that might have different wallets, that might have different kind of token specifications, different data indexing. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about like, how do we actually not only like abstract that from the user, but also build kind of scalable or extensible kind of architecture underneath the hood in order to allow us to expand into new chain environments, right? This is kind of what I was alluding to in my presentation. Um, so, all that to be said, like when I think about cross-chain UX, like of course the first kind of the general theme that I'm trying to um, kind of like implement against is abstraction, right? It's like how do you have some form of an overlay such that you're kind of only exposing to users like what is necessary and kind of like you know obfuscating the rest. And right now, like let's say we were to integrate like two chains that were like disparate, right? Like one's like EVM, another one's like a WASM chain. Um, like that would be pretty hard, I think, to like it would be a pretty harsh user experience, said differently for a user, right? Like you know different tokens, different wallets, et cetera, like a lot of different signing and token approvals, what have you. The blanket answer I have to solving that is like abstracting that using kind of a lot of the emerging narratives that we're seeing right now, which is around account abstraction, which is around using multi-party computation as a form of, you know, programmatic transaction construction. But instead of doing that, I think a lot of people are doing that within the context of like one chain. And so once you add like different chains to it, it becomes a lot more interesting. But essentially using like those primitives in addition to like some form of like a decentralized key management system in order to abstract that away into one sort of like unified wallet, right? And so we're not really in the wallet business, right? We don't necessarily see ourselves in that space, but we're thinking a lot about partnering with wallets and working with wallets on how to abstract away a lot of the cross-chain complexities and pain, honestly, and exposing that to the user. And so that's kind of like our idea of it. And maybe like to tie a bow on top of like kind of what I'm saying, like essentially it's essentially like smoothing the edges of an existing cross-chain experience, but eventually kind of what we want to do is of course what you mentioned, like take away the chain element in itself, and you basically just have an interface in which people express intents of like you know wanting to be on a certain place or wanting to do a certain action or wanting a certain asset, and then we're able to actually do that. And then you can actually take that. You know what? It's fine. But maybe we'll pause there, and I have a little bit to add after that.
No, I mean, you literally took the words out of my mouth. I was literally about to say, I mean, the sort of unification of this UX and also the MEV piece is like intent based, sort of like transactions, or I'm not really sure what the latest like phrase for this is, but the stuff that's being pioneered by Anoma and also now Flashbots with Suave, where users basically just say, hey, this is the end state that I want, and then you know other people fulfill that, and they kind of like make the state changes that make that happen. And the cool thing is that also solves, you know, it makes it so that MEV can be captured in more creative ways, and people can bid kind of on that MEV that could be captured through that user's intent. And so it's kind of like this unification of like it solves so many problems at once. It's like another really beautiful sort of insight that I'm looking forward to seeing. So I don't know, maybe that's where you were going to go with it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it ties really nicely to kind of the MEV narrative as well, of like intense. I didn't even mean intense in that perspective. I agree. It's like intense in the formal definition of like users expressing their like end state and having like executors like bundled transactions in order to achieve
Hmm.
it. And we very much see Catalyst playing like a very integral role in that because the way Catalyst is constructed is you can essentially have like a sense of cross-chain atomicity around like not only swapping assets cross-chain but actually doing actions like post like arriving in the destination chain, right? So it's like buying an NFT or performing like or voting on governance or doing XYZ,
Hmm.
right? And so we very much see Catalyst as like that like resource essentially for these executors in this like future MEV landscape that's
Hmm.
developing.
A last thing on UX, cross-chain UX, that's been a pain point in ecosystems like Cosmos, where there's lots of bridging happening, um, is this issue of the proliferation of different asset representations. So, you know, depending on how an asset is bridged or by whom to a new chain, like it's they're not fungible. They're like actually something different, and then it's like, oh well, now I can't like make a liquidity pool, or just like then it becomes confusing, and so I think that's a really big problem. I'm wondering, what is Catalyst doing? Do you guys think about that problem? Is there a way to solve it from your perspective?
Yeah, we think about it a lot. I think our perspective is that like that was kind of like the notion of like wrapping an asset and issuing some form of like synthetic representation of it was like a V1 or like a generation one solution to cross chain, and we're kind of proposing like a augmentation to that. And so when you look at like a wrapped representation, whether it be an ICS 20 kind of token that's floating around different chains in the Cosmos space, or if you're looking at more of like an actually bridged asset, right? Like an Axel asset, right? With Axlar or a X asset with like Wormhole. Um, they all kind of like run into the same problems that you're alluding to, right? They're different assets, and that's a major pain point that we see in the space. Of people are saying like, oh, I thought I was getting USDC on this chain, and I did get USDC, but it's kind of like someone's IOU of a USDC, and now I don't know how to swap out of it. Um, and so our solution, and you kind of maybe saw this when I was explaining how Catalyst works, is it's just native assets, right? Like we're not like V1 bridges was like, okay, we're gonna store assets on this one place and then mint more as like mint an IOU on another place. We're just saying, no, let's just leverage the native assets that live on each chain or to do the swaps. And if you need the case in which you have to have capital injection into a new bridge, right? Because that's kind of like what token bridges have originally been solving. It's like, how do we inject more capital into kind of like a new environment? You would have something more like a CCTP, right? Where you have like a burn and then some form of like an off chain attestation for a mint. And I think like when you look at other native bridges, like the DAI bridge that's being developed, that's very much along the lines of where the world's moving towards. And then we look at like Noble, like that's something that they're doing as well with like, their form of asset issuance. And so we're working very closely within that kind of with those people mentioned, but also kind of within that through line of like, okay, how do we emerge out of this world and create that new bridging experience that kind of mitigates the problem that you just described?
Very cool. Yeah. So the solution is that, rather than having to even move assets, just keep the assets where they're natively issued and enable people to sort of like move the value across the chain and redeem for other native assets. That's super cool.
Yeah,
A last question
yeah,
oh, go
and
ahead.
maybe like, oh, sorry, maybe like in addition on top of that is like maybe there's some economic value that could be like a lot of bridging uh, is to do an intent, right? To kind of tie it back to our previous like conversation topic. So if you have some form of bundling, have some form of atomicity around what those intents are to do on a specific chain, you can kind of just eliminate the need for bridging in general.
Mm.
And so we're also like approaching it from that angle.
Mm. Could you give an example of what that would mean or look like?
Yeah, sure. And so let's take an example of like I want to go to a new chain and take advantage of some yield farm, right?
Degen, baby.
I have, of course, yeah. It's a standard use case. We gotta speak everyone's language. um, so I have, like one ETH, and but that I want to deposit into this pool, right? Um, but knowing that like this is such an arduous process and there are kind of a lot of fees that can be taken along the way, and there might be some other pools that I want to take advantage of. I actually don't just bridge one ETH into this new environment. I bridge five ETH, right? I'm, rolling an ETH
YOLOing, yeah.
in this use case. Yeah. Um, and so now I just have four ETH or, like four wrapped ETH or what have you that's just sitting in this new environment, but I'm only using one. And so now I have this like weird inventory problem where like I'm anticipating more farms, but they're not there yet, but I have money on a place that is higher risk than I would feel comfortable with. Whereas with Catalyst, I can execute a different intent where I'm saying, hey, I just want to deposit on this farm and take advantage of it. Like I will swap one ETH's worth of value and acquire one ETH's worth of value on the destination chain, right? So it's like essentially like you're taking like before like when you bridge, your intent may have like a maybe predicting future intents, but we're essentially saying, hey, you don't need to do that projection anymore because like of the mech design we employ and the economics we deploy. You can just do your original intent, and if you have future intents, you can just execute them on an as needed basis.
Wow, super cool. Thank you for that. Last question on the technical side is related to Celestia and the notion of, sharing a data availability layer between these different chains. What, in your view, what's the significance of that, and how does it help with all this cross-chain bridging?
Yeah, I've written a good amount about bridges at this point. But I think one of the things that I keep coming back to is around what are the trust assumptions that need to, be inherited when you move across different zones of sovereignty, I guess is the word that people like to use, or different domains, right? And so different trust assumptions also means different thresholds of finality or different kind of definitions of soft confirmation, right? And so if you're moving across data availability layers, you basically have a lot of trust assumptions, right? And basically what that translates to is a pretty high bar for finality, because you don't want to pass a message that isn't going to be included into the canonical chain, right? In fact, like that would be detrimental for the destination chain because now they're basically just lost money. Um, and so we have a high definition for finality, which also means you have a lot of latency, right? And so that's the reason why when people are, if anyone tries to swap out a Polygon, why you have to wait 20 minutes is because, Polygon is known for their, 150, 200 block deep reorgs, right? And so you have to be absolutely certain, and that's 20 minutes. And you can imagine that 20 minutes is, I don't know. I rarely find anyone in the space that thinks 20 minutes is an okay user experience to wait for a cross-chain swap. And so when you have a shared data availability layer, you kind of mitigate a lot of those, right? You have less trust assumptions, which means you have a lower bar for soft confirmation. So if you have the DA proof, you're basically only operating the latency of the Celestia block time, right? And so that is a much better user experience, and hence why we like to work with, roll-ups building with Celestia, why we like to work, are working with the roll-kit team in order to enable Catalyst to facilitate swaps and have that kind of really streamlined user experience because of kind of that that mechanism that I just described.
Yeah, the way that I like to visualize it is that the Celestia block time is sort of like the heartbeat of the whole like ecosystem of rollups on top, because that's kind of when they synchronize. That's when each like the new sort of estates and the transactions for those rollups get all kind of like finalized essentially, and so that becomes sort of the heartbeat of like the cross chain I guess like interactions between those rollups too, and sharing that common heartbeat and that common like security of the data availability layer is like really really powerful for interoperability. Um, so yeah, I could not agree more. Speaking my language, um, and that's a big part of like why the modular stack is so transformative. Um,
Yeah, definitely. If I could just add one last thing there, I think maybe like a few weeks ago there was some conversation around how do you build like trust minimized bridges across different like zones of sovereignty, and I'm of the camp that that is not possible.
mm,
Like you're always inheriting. My understanding is maybe maybe that might change, right? Strong opinions weakly held, but that you will always be beholden to the honest majority assumption of the origin chain, and that's just the net of you know going across. Like if you're not sharing anything, you have to have those trust assumptions, and you have to have that kind of finality delay, which is where I think the next, I mean, can't share too much, but I think that's where Catalyst can play a key piece as well if you have to do that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, yeah, it's a really interesting problem space, and I've been thinking about that a lot lately. But I haven't really. I have some thoughts. I haven't been able to like formalize them yet. But I want to write like a forum post or a thread at some point about this problem of like true trust minimized bridging. But that's transitions really well into my next question, which is kind of uh, moving on from the technical piece, what and more into like the vision of Catalyst long term. And specifically, I wanted to say, because you mentioned in the beginning, bridging is just sort of the first step, but your like long term vision for Catalyst is much deeper and broader than that. It's about like building for this world of millions of chains. Um, so, what do you think is the next most important problem to solve in the cross chain stack once you've sort of built out this liquidity thing? Maybe it's this governance part or that you talked about. The coordination between these zones of sovereignty, or I don't know. Just tell me what is like the next big thing on your guys' mind after this first solving this first problem.
Yeah, I will say solving this first problem is already like a multi-year endeavor, because we're kind of starting from what we think is the most foundational, which is we want to have chains connect to each other automatically, and we want to be able to facilitate like economic activity between these chains permissionlessly, right? But there's a bunch of different augmentations that we want over time for that, right? We want to make the system more capital efficient. I think it behooves the entire crypto space to be more capital efficient. There's it's not number go up forever. We have to find a way to ensure security and liquidity is being wisely used. There needs to be kind of more improvements on the kind of like UX side, more improvements on UX as it pertains to like latency and finality between different chains. And so there's a number of things to do, right? I look at my roadmap every day. I'm like, wow, like got a long journey, but it's all about just like the drum beat, I've kind of learned that in my time in product. But afterwards, like we are, like I said, interoperability lovers first and foremost. And so once we lay the foundation of unified, capital efficient, permissionless slash automatic liquidity for a world of millions of chains, then we can start building more building blocks on top of that, right? Like then we can start building things around, I don't even want to give examples, so to speak, but that's kind of the foundation. But then, thinking about like I always like to use the analogy of like world trade, right? It's like, what does world trade look like with like free flowing like movement of value between different like nations? And that's things um, you know, that's things like access to liquidity upfront against collateral, right? Or like trade agreements, said differently, or it's like this like the promise of some like commodity for another commodity or for another value, right? And so those are like the foundational pieces that I kind of envision, and I think that analogy kind of helps a lot as we look at like roll ups and chains.
Yeah, I love the analogy of world trade, and in general, there's a lot of analogies you can draw between like sovereign blockchains and then like sovereign states, and there's a lot of things translate over, and there's a lot of like metaphors that sort of carry over. I really like that. It's exciting to think about the future of blockchains with the framing of world trade. Cool. So I'm curious then, just one other question it is like, where do you see the modular stack itself 5 years from now? Um, what will change? Like, what is the user experience? What is the developer experience? Where do you see this space going?
Oh man, I could give a very long answer. Yeah, like I could literally go down every piece of the stack and say how I think it's gonna unfold. But I'll try to keep it like to like maybe three hot takes,
Okay.
so to speak. Um, I think on the execution layer, like it's going to be um, like almost like I think when you look at an execution layer, there's a lot of debate on what an execution layer is, but I think everyone agrees that it's at very least a virtual machine, and you can probably argue maybe block space as well. And so that becomes like very commoditized and not commoditized, but like it becomes very abstracted, right? And so you kind of interacting with it not too different to how you interact with a AWS compute instance, right? And so that's kind of how I see that unfolding. And you see a lot of these like RAS projects are kind of going towards that, right? It's like, okay, you're pricing this, like Saga like prices it based on like some notion of like usage, right? So that kind of mirrors the kind of AWS slash Docker kind of business model. And then you can customize a lot of things with it, right? It's like, and it becomes quite trivial to kind of change those different parameters. It literally just looks like a config. And yeah, sorry, that's too long of an answer, but like that's kind of how I see that unfolding. It's like it becomes just like really trivial and customizable and very easy. Not too much of a hot take, but that's how I see it. Um, I think for the other part, so yeah, maybe I take number two. For the other parts of the stack, I kind of alluded to this, but there will come a time in which maybe we don't hit like a asymptote, so to speak, of like the money in the system in crypto, but it gets very slow, right? The increase of it. And in that sense, it needs to become less zero sum, in which we're leveraging this money for things that we need to do, which is, I think, right now, like security, right, in the form of POS, um, and also liquidity. And so that's why I think a lot of people are very excited about restaking, very excited about LSDs, because they provide some notion of capital efficiency in order to allow us to use this kind of finite amount of money in the pool to do things that we need to do, right? And so when you look at like security, right, every kind of primitive within the stack needs some notion of security that needs to be reused somehow. And I think you can find really interesting coordination that occurs once you see like, who's you reusing which layers reusing which layers security, or which layers liquidity for security, right? And so that's kind of how we see that unfolding. We got to get a lot more efficient in that perspective. My last take is that I think we're going to see maybe like one more stack emerge honestly. I don't know exactly how that's going to slice, but if I had to say, I would say that like we're maybe decoupling. I mean, depends on how you feel about settlement layer, but you're maybe decoupling settlement into two different pieces. One is like the the validation of a transaction from like a execution layer, and the other one would be the validation of an outside layer, like an outside execution layer interacting with a native one. So said differently, it's like basically like a bridge verifier, right? I think like a bridge verifying and verifying of like a roll up slash execution layer on top of a settlement layer looks very different, and I feel like that probably needs to be split apart.
Mm,
Yeah, those are kind of my unorganized thoughts
I love it.
on the future of
I love
modular.
it. Yeah. I mean, this is my favorite thing to talk about, as you can probably tell. Um, well, Jim, it's been awesome to learn about Catalyst, to have you on. What's your like upcoming roadmap? What can people expect from you guys in the coming months or the next year? Like what are the big milestones you guys are working towards?
Yeah, so um, let's go in chronological order. So white paper
Nice.
coming out
Eagerly
in the next few weeks.
awaiting that.
Yeah, maybe then I can come back on and actually answer your questions instead of deflecting. Um, Test nets in the summer,
Ooh,
so get excited for that. Um, we're a Cosmos project. We're proud to be a Cosmos project, so we'll be launching on Cosmos end of this year, and then we'll come home to Ethereum next year.
nice. Cool.
Hmm.
Well, a lot of stuff in the future for you guys, and so maybe at some point we can have you guys back on for an update. Where can people, learn more about what you guys are building and follow you guys' progress?
Yeah, I would say if I had to give a pithy answer, just follow us on Twitter. It's Catalyst AMM on Twitter. You can also, check out our documentation. You can go to our website. You can sign up for our wait list for our testnet. But all roads lead back to our Twitter, so just follow us there.
Yeah, and I think people should also follow you. I love your insights. You've been writing a lot of great blog posts and stuff on this subject. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on. This was really, really an interesting conversation. Bridging is one of the most important problems I think that we need to solve in the modular stack. So I'm stoked that a team as talented as yours is working on this, and you guys are really taking a new direction and approach to solving this problem. So it's just very exciting all around. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think more and more as the modular kind of blockchain thesis that kind of pervades throughout the system. Is that a word? Permeates throughout the system. Bridging becomes super important, right? I had this like revelation a couple weeks ago. I'm like, wow, like bridging is incredibly like more important than I thought, because you need to coordinate all the layers, and you need to coordinate different layers with shared layers, and it gets quite complicated. So I'm even more excited than I was a month ago about building and bridging, which is I didn't even know that was possible.
As am I, as am I. Well, thanks again for coming on, Jim, and we'll be following you guys closely.
Yeah, thanks for having me.